This is Coach Schuman here for the Success for Life podcast. I have a very special guest on here today, Buck Joffrey, former medical doctor who is now, well, still an MD, but who has translated his incredible intelligence, incredible knowledge into the wealth accumulation, management, and development field, helping other people really success from a financial standpoint. Welcome to the Success for Life podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Tell everybody a little bit about your background. You have a very unique background. You don't find a ton of medical doctors, surgeons that go on and tackle. They usually just take their money and sock it away, right? That tackle the actual wealth formula equation and how to accumulate that. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I am I would characterize myself as your typical A student. I graduated, went to one of the better colleges, better named colleges out there, got A's there, went to one of the better medical schools out there, got A's there, ended up in a neurosurgery residency and did some additional training in cosmetics later after doing head and neck surgery. I'm massively overtrained, massively overschooled, massively in terms of academics, what you would call a success. What I would tell you is that what is unique, I would say, is that most people who are the reason that most people like me, who are good students and surgeons and such, don't end up becoming entrepreneurs and doing anything different is because we're not really used to failing in life, right? So I didn't really fail in life per se. And that wasn't my reason for going into entrepreneurship. After finishing my training in 2008, I actually, like a lot of entrepreneurs, read a Robert Kiyosaki book by accident in a Puerto Vallarta airport. I found it in some dingy bookstore, and it was a cash flow quadrant. And to that date, I read it on the plane. It was on the way back from my honeymoon, and it was like a lightning bolt hit me. It was like nobody told me that this entire world of entrepreneurship existed, right? I was just going through school. I was going through this entire paradigm that everybody else does that was created by the Industrial Revolution, which was plop information in, one first grade, second grade, all the way through 12th grade, and then you have a finished product. And I did really well with that, but I didn't know that this entrepreneurial world existed. So for me, that was fortunate because I think most people who get on the success treadmill never get off, and it leads to a highly mediocre life. And so I did. I said, you know what? This guy Kiyosaki's onto something. And rather than get a job and become an academic like I was thinking about, I started a private practice and started it with the intention of eventually phasing myself out. And I did that. I phased myself out after a couple years and started another business. And I call them businesses because I marketed on television, radio, internet. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I still have that cosmetic surgery business. We market $1 million a year, a marketing budget. These were businesses that I created, right? And what ended up happening was all of a sudden I had money. And I never had money before, right? As a surgical resident, and I was making $45,000 a year in San Francisco in 2008, which was way below the poverty line in San Francisco. And I didn't initially know exactly what to do with it. So what I did is I didn't want to invest it the way everybody else had, because the timing was really good for me. It was 2008, 2009. Everybody just got thrown to the ringer by Wall Street. And my dad happened to be effectively a slumlord when I was growing up. But you know what? He did well. And he made enough money. I never really had to worry about money. I always grew upper middle class. So keeping that in mind, I thought, you know what? I'm going to buy real estate. And especially since this Kiyosaki guy thinks it's a good idea, I'm going to start doing that too. And so I went down that path instead. And I realized that there was so much to learn out there all of a sudden. It wasn't like most of people like me, they just turn to some guy who's like 5 years older than them and say, hey, can I who do you put your money with? And they give some wealth advisor's name, and then they make that wealth advisor a ton of money for the next 20 years, right? That's the way it typically works. But to me, I was like, listen, I was smart enough to create these businesses out of nothing, zero to, ultimately at one point up to 15, 20 million in revenue within a course of 4 or 5 years. And if I can do that, why can't I do something with my money that's more creative than giving it to some other guy who probably I make more money than, right? So that's when the whole thing started. And that's when I went down this pathway of trying to, and in what I considered sort of the journey to uncover the world of the ultra wealthy and the affluent, because I didn't want to be average. I didn't want to be mediocre. And I don't even say mediocre in the sense of, you're a neurosurgeon. Are you mediocre? Well, no, you're not mediocre in a bad way. You're just, you're just plugging away. You're just doing a job and you're giving your money to somebody. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have my destiny in my own hands, and investing is probably the part that most entrepreneurs neglect the most, right? Super powerful, sexy entrepreneurial activities, and then they make money, invest like their grandma.
Right. So that's really interesting because, as a neurosurgeon or anybody that, you built the business up there, you're trading your time for money, right? And, and ultimately that time for money, you start to get into kind of a cap level, like, right? How far can I extend myself? Can I replicate myself? Is that possible? And I've gone through it myself in business that I've built. You get to a point, you try to replicate yourself, or you replicate it through other people that are working with you. Very difficult to do, very difficult to scale. Even if you start to scale it, then quality can become an issue here and there. And then when you go into wealth creation and specifically real estate, you start to kind of maybe get out of that game. So someone who looks to transition from, I guess, 2 questions. First of all, you had some capital when you started. So do you feel that people need to have a certain amount of capital before they kind of jump into it? Is that something that's necessary, and how much is necessary?
Yeah, I do think it's necessary. I mean, here's the thing, right? Entrepreneurship is a great place to generate the capital needed to invest. But, it's hard to invest without money. I mean, that's one of the biggest, fallacies out there. You hear in a podcast, and it sounds like all you need to do in real estate is, say you're in real estate and start talking about cash flow, and you're going to become you're going to be financially free in 5 years. It doesn't work that way. The reality is that there is math behind this. The math is that, wealth is, I have an equation. I usually say it's wealth is the product of mass, which is how much money you put into investments, times leverage, which is using other people's money, times velocity, which is essentially your return, your cash on cash investment, cash on cash returns. And so the big challenge there is that, you got to have mass, right? Then it doesn't matter how much leverage or velocity you have. You got to have mass. So, to your point about, working harder, multiplying yourself, I think for a period of time, that's okay. I mean, I think in the entrepreneurial world, we often talk about scaling. We often talk about, don't have a business that just relies on yourself. I think these things are all true. But sometimes if you're doing pretty well with that, then you're creating money that you can use to do other things, right? One of the mistakes that I have found that a lot of my entrepreneurial friends have made, and to a certain extent I made early on, was that they get so uniformly interested in just their own business that they never take money off the table to start to invest and create other streams of income that are maybe more passive, maybe not require as much time. And they do really, really well. They're making, $1 million, $2 million a year, and they keep dumping extra money to grow and grow and grow. And then one day, something bad happens, right? And maybe it's a temporary thing, but you don't have a lot of money. And then you realize, holy cow, I got everything I own, everything I am in this business. And that is scary as hell, right? That's scary as hell. And so I have been there to a certain extent, and I have done that to a certain extent. So I would just say to people that, if you're doing well, I mean, that's great. Just make sure that you start thinking of, okay, well, what happens if this business goes south? Am I coming up with a plan B simultaneously that's not going to make it so I'm like completely broke?
And I want to recap so the listeners can understand it. I think what's really interesting is your formula: wealth, mass times leverage times velocity, which is cash on cash. So the cash you make, and then utilizing that, right? That's to be able to turn it over.
That's velocity.
Yeah. Got it. And then obviously, Kiyosaki is a big on multiple streams of income. So you're talking entrepreneurship, leading. You might have to trade some time for cash. In order to build your initial capital, and then taking that and then be able to spin that, following that formula to your second stream of income, which some form of real estate and utilizing that kind of financial sector to be able to build a second stream.
It doesn't necessarily have to be real estate. What I would tell you is, and this is kind of, this is what my podcast is about, Wealth Formula Podcast, which is that I invest in a lot of things, right? In a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be real estate. What my point is simply that you can, if you do a little homework and you're crafty, and you all out there are entrepreneurs, you're all crafty and you're curious and you're interested in learning, treat it like another business. Treat your investments like another business, right? If you look at the paradigm that the wealthy follow, that's what they do, right? They don't make a bunch of money, and the Rockefellers are not investing in mutual funds,
Right.
I mean,
right.
So why are you?
Right.
That's the point. If you're crafty and you can educate yourself a little bit, you're going to find that you can get much better returns than you're just going to give to, some wealth advisor. People talk about how the market's done so well in the last few decades. And if you look purely on the S&P 500, those numbers are decent, but the reality is that most people have these retirement accounts, and those go into mutual funds. And if you look over the last 3 decades, people have averaged between 3 and 3.5%. And that's barely over inflation.
Right.
So you got to wake up to that, and you got to not just be, and it doesn't require as much time, and it doesn't require as much effort as building your business. And if you're anything like the other entrepreneurs who listen to my show and part of, my community, you're going to really get into it, because you realize, holy cow, there is 2 completely different worlds out there. One is for the poor, the middle class, and the upper middle class suckers who could afford to be investing like the rich. And then there is the way that the ultra wealthy and rich invest. It's completely different.
What's an instrument that people might not normally utilize in building their wealth that you recommend? And how do you utilize it in your portfolio?
Here's a good one right here. So there's a product which, we always use kind of names so people recognize them. But we got Wealth Formula Banking. It's got a lot of names to it, but that's what we call it. And it's a type of whole life insurance product, but it's not really used for insurance purposes. The idea is that you overfund this thing, and you get, ultimately what it results in over the course of a couple of years is 2 things. It results in your life insurance becomes free after about 2 years because of the money you're making on it, and then you have this fixed return on investment that you get on that, which is typically about 5 to 6% per year. Now that in itself is not super exciting to me, although 5 to 6% and it grows tax free, that's actually pretty good. But to me, I'm totally greedy about returns. 5-6% does not get me excited. But what here's really interesting is that the way that the wealthy set them up, and the way that in Wealth Formula Banking concept sets it up, that usually by the end of the second year, all the money that you've put in becomes cash value. In other words, you can borrow it back out. So you might wonder, why in the world would I borrow money out anyway? I mean, then what's the point of even putting it in, right? Well, you're getting 5-6% on it, compounding interest. And remember what compounding interest is, right? Everybody talks about magic of compounding interest and you show that crazy graph going up. It just means that every time you make money, it goes back in, and then the next time the yield goes on the initial principal plus whatever you made, and then it creates even more money. But what's interesting about it is you can actually borrow from those accounts. So if you borrow at a simple interest rate. So now let's put that into context. Say you have money growing, say you got $50,000 that's accumulated into this account, and you have, and it's growing at 50%, or it's growing at 5% fixed, or 5% compounding, 5% compounding. Now you borrow it at 5%. So basically what you have is a situation where you are growing your money at a fixed rate, and it's compounding. It's 5% compounding. You're borrowing it maybe at 4% or maybe even 5%. But the difference is that it's at a simple interest rate. So if we look at a line of like a graph, and this is where it gets kind of goofy, but you look at a compounding rate, it takes off. A simple rate just stays nice and straight. So every year, what's happening is that even though you've borrowed money out of one of these accounts, you're still making money. Even though you've taken that money out, you're still making money in that account.
Right, because the compounding interest is greater than the simple interest, right?
Exactly. And then you can take that simple interest product and you can use that as a down payment or whatever investment you have. And now you're literally growing money in two places at the same time with just one capital injection.
That's incredibly interesting because I don't think a lot of people know about that.
Right.
And when people get life insurance, a lot of times they put in whatever the minimum amount is, barely accumulates any cash flow, or it takes a long time to do that, right? And then get disheartened by the fact that they look at it after, a few years of putting money in, or 5 or even 10 years, and there's not a real wealth component to it.
It's because they're not designed for the benefit of the client. Most of these are not. The way that the ones that, middle class, even upper middle class, again, doctors, I got shown these kinds of policies when I just finished my training, and they didn't make any sense to me necessarily. But I remember looking at these, and they were not good investments. The products that we're talking about are the way the rich people do it, right? We're talking about the Romneys and the Rothschilds and stuff. And with these kinds of products, at cash value, let me give you an example of when I started this. At the end of the first year, I had 90% of the cash flow of the first year premium, right? So for those people who understand a little bit what I'm talking about, that's really not what you ordinarily see. Ordinarily, you don't see cash accumulation for a few years.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what we're talking about here is that by the end of year 2, you're actually over 100%. And now you're all positive trajectory. Your insurance is for free. It's a pure investment account at this point. And so that's just one example. There's another example, again, using a similar type of insurance product. Again, you'll never see, because these are the types of things that usually you only see if you're ultra wealthy. But it's the Index Universal Life. We call it Velocity Plus to make it easier. But basically, in that situation, what you're doing is it's an options play with the insurance company, and you put in money. It tracks the S&P 500, and they'll let you take 12-13% of the upside. But if the market crashes and corrects by 30%, you don't lose any money. So you only participate in the upside, not in the downside. Now, that in of itself sounds like a pretty good deal for most people, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
It's basically saying, I'll take 12 or 13%. And if the market crashes, well, hey, I didn't make any money that year, but I didn't lose any either, right? But what you can add to that, if you have some level of money, say you've got a six-figure income, is you can add leverage. Now that gets really interesting, right? Because even with 3-to-1 leverage, In other words, the bank is putting money in, right? So you're maybe instead of doing a $20,000 per year premium, now is 20,000 from you, and then the bank's putting in, 60. If you do that, and why would banks do that? Well, again, you got the upside, but not the downside. They'll loan you money on that all the time, right? And they'll do it typically, 1% over LIBOR. So the ultra wealthy are taking these, and they're putting massive amounts of leverage on them, right? To the point where sometimes you don't even have to put money in. It's all collateralized. And then what happens is when you put leverage on, the S&P 500, it becomes very, very interesting. Let's just take, for example, 3-to-1 leverage, which anybody who makes, $100,000 per year or more can do.
Right.
You can, if you take 3-to-1 leverage, a 7% return on the S&P 500 in a given year actually will result in a 19 to 20% gain in your portfolio.
It's enormous.
Yeah, it's an enormous difference. And if you get actually 12 or 13% in the market, now you're talking about, high 20s in terms of returns in your account. And then if it crashes the next year, guess what? You didn't lose any money.
Right.
So again, these types of products, these are the ones that the wealthy use. They're not the ones that the poor middle class and upper middle class who should know better but don't.
Right.
Use. So
now, how do they find these policies? Because they're not, like you said, not normally presented to them, right? So how is that discovered? How do you find the right guy to help you with that?
It was really, for me, it was trial and error. And ultimately I found some people who were, wealthy people who were doing these types of things. And they explained to me why they're doing it. Because the thing that you can say, usually with the people who've got a lot of money and they're investing, is usually they're not the ones getting ripped off, right? They're usually not the ones. New money, young doctors, etc., they're getting ripped off left and right. These guys are really savvy. And so there's webinars on 2 of both of these products. If you're curious, that you can go to wealthformulabanking.com. And I did 2 webinars with the guys who do these products on that. And, I asked them a bunch of questions afterwards, and there's like audience participation, but they're so interesting. Even if you have no intention of doing it, it's probably worth watching just to know that this world is out there, and you might be scratching your head going, well, my insurance guy says you can't do that. Well, I know that because the guys I started out with were like these Northwestern Mutual guys. And when I heard about this, I said, hey, why am I not doing this? And they were like, I never really heard of that. Yeah, complete BS. It's because they don't offer it. And typically these things don't pay as much commission to the brokers. But if the brokers on the broker side, if they minimize, the commissions to the minimums, and they're dealing only with high net worth clients or people who are making 6 figures, they're doing great. And that's why they do it.
Well, that's the interesting component. And I guess you get a lot of, with these new insurance people, so Northwest Mutual, fairly new brokers, fairly new guys in the marketplace, they only have been taught the basics and don't know anything beyond that. So when they go to advise you, they're in a churn and burn, mode of trying to reach out to as many people, offer the same product or same couple of products over and over again. And it's important that people have to realize they got to do the research, because they've got to understand where they're actually putting their money. In our pre-conversation, I think you really made that clear, where people, they just go, okay, this is what my grandmother did, this is what my grandfather did, this is what my father did, and this is what I do with it. And I see it in my own life, like I talk to my wife about what we want to do with things, and she goes and talks to her father, and he has some good things, but that's the formula that they're following, right? So It's hard to get people. How do you get people to start to think differently?
It's helpful if you have a group of entrepreneurs, because they're used to it, right? Because first of all, paradigms are very, very difficult to break. If you just think about how zealous people get about even, not getting too deep into this, but just religion, right? I mean, just look at how religion can make people do really great things, or religion can make people do some very bad things. If you are religious and there is something that, you do that is considered a sin, you feel bad about it, right? I mean, to a certain extent, all belief systems are built and predicated the same way. So with my, I have an accredited investor group, and we, when I'm talking to people and we're talking about maybe taking down a large acquisition together, and they'll be, they love the idea, right? And then they come back to me and they'll say, yeah, everything makes sense. And I mean, I'm just blown away by this, but wait a second. The problem is, for some reason, I feel kind of like I'm doing something wrong.
Interesting.
Why is that? Well, because it's outside of the whole paradigm. The problem is that paradigms are often wrong. Conventional wisdom is often wrong. I mean, look, the world's not flat. We thought it was flat for a long time, right? In medicine, we remember when you're kids and you look up on the wall and you saw the food pyramid, right? Anybody who's into
yes, yeah, absolutely.
It was wrong, but for the longest time, it was conventional wisdom. And guess what? That food pyramid was there because some Harvard scientists got paid off by the sugar industry to downplay the role of of sugar in cardiac disease. And that resulted in a generation or two of obese people.
Absolutely.
So what you find is not only can conventional wisdom be wrong, but conventional wisdom can be the product of special interests. And that's where Wall Street comes in investing, right? So how is it that we look at, Wall Street and mutual funds and we think it's the right thing to do? It's conservative. What the hell is conservative anyway? Before Wall Street, the wealthiest people in the world were, and they still don't, invest in mutual funds. They own real things, right? They own real things. That's the way you create wealth. And it doesn't have to be, when I invest in apartment buildings now, by the way, I don't go out there and buy them and manage them, get calls from tenants. I'm buying into larger syndications, or some of my investors really like the turnkey rentals, right? Where you're basically getting in there and, somebody else is managing everything. You might as well just be buying a piece of paper. You own it. Somebody else is managing it, sending you checks, right? So it's a different, and Wall Street calls those kinds of things, quote unquote, alternative assets.
Right.
Like, it sounds like they've got a nose ring and blue hair or something like that, right? But the reality is those things have been around a lot longer than mutual funds. And they have created generational wealth, gold, fine, precious metals, real estate, insurance products. I mean, I as much as it's hard for people to even get it because they've been burned by so many lousy brokers out there, insurance products. So yeah, that's the big message that I've got.
I think that's incredibly interesting, and finding those kind of investments and finding example, putting your money in, like, so I follow you. You're probably familiar with Grant Cardone, right? And, and he talks. He's kind of puts together some of these funds now, right? He's just one guy, but obviously he's out there all the time running the shows and everything like that. Media is a big part of what he does. But I get the message there, right? So the message is put your money into it to turn into something. What do you think? When someone's investing in these properties, what type of properties should they be looking at? So should they be looking at these high amount of unit properties, smaller unit properties, single family homes, corporate real estate? What type of real estate projects probably not the best?
I think generally speaking, I like bigger assets. I think that if you can put 25 grand or 20 grand or whatever into and just have a small piece of a 300 unit 400 unit apartment building, you're much better off than in my opinion than taking that 25 grand and buying a turnkey rental. And the reason for that is that the size and turns it into a very stable asset, right? There's single family house, you got either 0% vacancy or 100% vacancy. And guess what? When somebody's not in there and you've got a debt, you're paying. There's one roof per house. When that roof goes bad, there goes your cash flow for the last 7 years. There's, and so there's no such thing as 90% occupancy, which is typically the goal in a larger asset. You're trying to push rents. So I like larger assets. I like multifamily a lot. The problem with multifamily a little bit is that, it's at the top of the cycle as well. So it's harder to get good returns. So I haven't looked at Cardone's offerings myself. I mean, I work with some other groups myself that we primarily we're primarily after, we deal with accredited investors.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, so those things are good. And some other areas that I like for right now, I mean, I like self-storage right now. This is one of the few real estate areas in 2008, 2009 that actually wasn't in the red. And that's because people have stuff and they need to leave it somewhere. And it's, if you buy this stuff, you can raise rents fairly quickly and people get irritated, but they won't move their stuff.
Very
right?
true.
And I got one group that I work with that they raise on average about 20% per year because none of these are year-long leases, right? They're just adding on another $1 here, $1 there. The next, every year it's 20% up. I mean, that's crazy. When you look at multifamily, it's usually you're expecting hopefully 2 to 3% per year. So I like those.
And does the occupancy rate of like self-storage, for the most part, maintain itself? Does it ever dip, or does it have a pretty steady flow? So when you increase that percentage-wise, you're basically making your money on those increases. Yeah,
I mean, I think it depends a lot on, obviously with the operations, you want to push those, you want to find that equilibrium where you're, the price that you're charging and the occupancy balances out. The interesting thing about self-storage is that it's sort of recession-proof for the reasons I said before, but it's also very responsive to the demographic of the baby boomers. Because if you can imagine, we've got all this baby boomers are starting to retire, and the self-storage facility that we acquired was in Naples, Florida. And Naples is it's like the number one retirement community within Florida, right? So imagine all these people coming into Florida and they've had, the same house for 40, 50 years. And they bring all their stuff with them and they need to put it somewhere because they're never going to throw away that stuff, right? And so the more of those people you can get in an area, the better as well.
Right. So the mature individual.
Yeah, exactly. The mature individual. Now, just to be clear, I think it's an important point that you brought up with the way Grant's doing stuff too, because this is really important. This stuff used to only be available to the ultra wealthy. You could really only invest and have fractional ownership if you were what's called an accredited investor. And I've said it a few times, but basically the definition is, you make over $200,000 per year. $300,000 per year if you're filing jointly, or you have a net worth of $1 million outside of your personal residence. But it used to be the case that you couldn't invest in anything like this unless you met those criteria. And with the offerings that I do through my group, they are typically all for accredited investors. But so I heard, and I actually haven't seen this, but Grant is doing some things with the regulation crowdfunding,
Yes.
which allows basically, you know, anybody to invest, which I think is great. I think it's great he's doing that.
And that's all part of what the Jobs Act is.
Right, exactly. That is the Jobs Act right there. It made it so that more people, the government realized that, you know, the ultra wealthy, or, you know, the affluent in general who have access to these deals, they got a much better situation, right? Because outside of, you know, buying your own rental house and managing it or whatever, there was no way for you to get exposure to these incredible assets like real estate, or even for that matter, non-performing notes. You know, that's an area I'm starting to get into myself now. But now, if you want exposure to that and you want better returns, typically, you know, in real estate, we like to shoot for double digits or more. You know, we don't get excited when we hear about, you know, 5 or 6%, unless it's part of well formula banking and you're just using it to double dip. But these types of things, the government recognized, hey, it's really not that fair that people are not getting opportunities to this. So they just needed to put a couple different more layers of due diligence in there for people who wanted to go that route. And so that's what I think Grant's doing. That's what, you know, some of these other, you know, Yield Street and some of these other crowdfunding platforms are doing. And I think they're great. I mean, I do think if you're accredited, it's sometimes better to look at, you know, get to know an individual team, an operator. Right. And, you know, if you're willing to put in $50,000, $100,000 at a time or whatever, it might be even better, because then you don't have between you and the, you know, the sponsor, you don't have this platform and you can actually talk to a human being. So
I think the Jobs Act is one of the most interesting pieces of legislation for that standpoint. I think when people get to an accredited investor standpoint, I agree with you that you could probably have a lot more assurances of where you're putting your money if you're an accredited investor, because you could potentially still have some of the pitfalls that you had before with the Jobs Act, because crowdfunding, you know, the regulation. I mean, there's regulation, but there's not the level of regulation that you can get. You can lose your money, but you can lose your shirt on anything, right? So,
and that's the moral of the story. I mean,
right.
Listen, you know, as long as you don't lose the property, you own an asset, right? And eventually, you know, if you look at the national debt, it was $20 trillion now, 21. There's only two ways that you can keep up with the national debt and, you know, and pay it off. Is one is that you know, that GDP growth, that growth is so robust that it just creates massive amounts of tax revenue for the government. That's one way. Or you can just continue to print money, and you continue to print money, and that's inflation, right? So if you own a real asset, it will appreciate with inflation. And so you have some solace in knowing. The worst thing you can do in my book is just have money in the bank. Because right. Not only is it, you know, people say, well, you know, they talk about risk. If you have money in the bank, if you take inflation into consideration, inflation probably right now is maybe 2.5%, 3%. It's probably going to go up to 4 or 5 eventually here because of the amount of debt. The worst thing you can do is just let that money sit in the bank. If you let that money sit in the bank for 30 years, you've lost 2/3 of its value, you know? And that's crazy, right? So if you're not investing, you're not being conservative. You are just guaranteeing that you're losing money.
You're guaranteeing your losses.
That's right. You're fixing them in.
You lock in your losses now.
Right, exactly.
I think that's some really, really incredible stuff, and stuff that people really need to begin to understand, is to be mindful of it. And because there's so much information out there, they can, you know, now they have the position to be able to do the research necessary. I mean, shoot, they can just listen to your podcast and get a lot of that information themselves. I guess my final question is, what is the right mix of, and maybe it's percentage of where you put your money in investing versus building your business versus real estate? What do you feel is, I guess, the best mix to do with your money?
I think it depends a little bit on how old you are, right? I mean, if you're in your 20s and 30s and you're just plowing money, early 30s, you're just plowing money back into your business. I get it. I've been there. You just want to, but you got to at some point, start splitting it, and me right now, I'm 44, and I'd say, for me, reinvestment at this point in anything I'm doing, it's probably like 25%, right? 75% of the money I'm making, I'm driving it into other things that I know are proven to make me money over time. So that if one of my businesses, and I just had one business that just kind of went south after being massively lucrative and ending up shutting it down. Now, if I only had that business, I'd be screwed, right? But now I've got all sorts of these other things going on. It takes time, but I think as long as you're out there putting some aside and getting some, what I would call financial education, because that's really what this is, and using it and thinking of this as your second business, this little business that you're starting, and you're going to figure out how you're going to take this amount of money and turn it into more money. I mean, that's a business, right?
Right.
If you can work on that as a secondary business, I think that over time, you may find that you're like, well, gosh, I'm making more money than I am in my original business. And, so I think that how much is a tough question. I mean, it's a personal thing for sure, but I do think everybody ought to think about it, because I can just tell you that I would have done things a little differently. I took some big swings that I thought, well, gosh, if I do that and that works out, it's a $50 million, payday, and failed and realized that was 2 years of all the money I made. And those are dead years now. And I'm not saying don't take your shot. It's just be careful. That's all.
Right. Be smart how you take your shot.
Smart. Yeah.
Incredibly educational. I mean, one of the most educational interviews that I've ever done. Can you just tell the people where they can get your podcast, where they can find you, any social areas and website, and so they can get in touch with you and find out more?
Yeah. So the podcast is just Wealth Formula Podcast, and you can find that iTunes, Stitcher, we put it on YouTube as well. Wealthformula.com. It's there as well. There is there's a book that you can get at wealthformula.com. It's 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth, which is really just foundational stuff. Like it's just trying to look and reset a paradigm like we talked about before, and talking about like the way wealth has been created historically a little bit, right? So that's probably useful. And I think those are the. You could also text me for that book. You could text 44222, and then just put in Wealth Formula, which is one word, 44222 Wealth Formula, and you can get access to that book for free. It's not, it's the basics, but the podcast is really, and we have a forum and community if you get interested in it later. But start with a podcast, and I think that if you're interested, I think you'll, in what we talked about today, I think you'll find that interesting. So,
yeah, I think the rabbit hole of wealth that you're talking about could really be a lucrative one, and people identifying and understanding that is unbelievable. Well, I thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The information is invaluable. So many things that you're sharing, people probably have no idea about, and that's one of the beauties of a podcast like that, being able to share that information. I can't thank you enough for being on the Successful Life podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
Hey, my pleasure.